The following video contains content about the crossing, the intersection of religion and transphobia. These are heavy subjects, so if you don't want to deal with it today, maybe go do some self-care instead. Tend to your garden, take a hot bath, or load a bowl of cereal and watch SpongeBob. Wherever you find your bliss. Portions of Aunt Tracy's dialogue were inspired by arguments made before the Supreme Court by ACLU staff attorney and total dreamboat Chase Strangio. Sources used in the production of this video are listed in the description. Unless the source is an asshole, in which case, find your own platform. Did I misspell anything this time? Nah, that waitress job only lasted like a day. Well, 6 hours. Some a-hole customer. He's all like, oh, I never have this problem when I eat at other restaurants. Yeah, and I'm all, that's a coincidence. I never have this problem when you eat at other restaurants either. Yeah, it kind of escalated from there. The general manager totally overreacted when I threw that Diet Pepsi in his face. I mean, come on, I was going to bring him a refill. It's going to be tight. I literally spent all morning looking for a job. I seen a rainbow yesterday, but too many storms have come and gone, leaving a trace of not a God-given ray. Is it because my life is 10 shades of gray? I pray I'll tend and fade away. I seldom praise him for a sunny day. And like his promise is true, only my faith can undo the many chances I blew to bring my life to a new, clear blue and unconditional skies. Dry the tears from my eyes, no more lonely cries. My only bleeding hope is for the folk who cannot cope with such an enduring pain that it keeps them in the pouring rain. Who's to blame for tooting Cain in your own vein? What a shame you shoot a name for someone else's brain and claim the insane and name the day and time for falling prey to crime. I say the system got you victim to your own mind. Dreams are hopeless aspirations and hopes are coming true. Believe in yourself, the rest is up to me. And why don't I swallow my pride and ask my parents for the money? Baby, don't I already swallow enough? Oh, hang on, I got another call. Hit pay dirt with K-Dirt. Obscure movie reference, let it go. How's it my fault? I don't even go to your church. It makes my skin burn. How do you blackmail a nun? Oh, to get into heaven? Well, no, I certainly didn't put the idea of blackmail in their head. Now, the princess could have been really mean right there, and she could have said that the ogre offered her to get her crown back if she went down on him. Will you tell him I said he was a lame framing device? Yeah, I'll talk to him. Bring him on over. I haven't seen my sister this fired up since they instituted the mask mandate at Waffle House. Believe it or not, I went to Sunday school every week as a youngster. For the most part, I loved it. They would pick all us kids up on a big green bus, and we'd sing fun songs. Red and yellow, black and white. It's W or B, yeah, yeah, yeah. Jesus loves the little children. He's so fine, it blows my mind. Hey, Jesus. Hey, Jesus. Yeah, prayer's gonna pray. Put your money in the plate. And if the devil doesn't like it, he can sit on attack. What? Sit on attack? Who slid on attack? Huh? Wicca Slim Hades. I'd be lying if I didn't say that the ladies who taught Sunday school didn't put the fear of God in me, though. I used to toss and turn in my bunk bed, praying for forgiveness from eternal damnation on the off chance that I should die before I wake. As a child, I was terrified of 3 things: going to hell, nuclear annihilation, and invisible werewolves. But now, as a rational adult, I realize that only 2 of these are legitimate fears. And before y'all start leaving comments about how I've never seen an invisible werewolf, precisely my point. It could be anywhere. Where's my Lone Ranger gun? That can't be them already. Well, someone is sure in a hurry. Careful, my shoes are in there. Ollie Ollie oxen free. Oh, come on, don't be like that. You're not in any trouble. Don't be mad at me. I didn't put you up to this. Honey, please don't make me coerce you to come out of the closet. You know it's a very bad look for your Aunt Tracy. Hey, I'll show you what's out the window. No, I promise. No tricks this time. You want to see what's out the window for real? Yeah, come on, let's go see what's out the window.
These nasty old wolves dressed one of their kind to look like little Bo Peep. Out he did go with one thought in mind, to capture the poor little sheep.
Now tell your Aunt Tracy, why are you so concerned about getting into heaven all of a sudden? You're just the sweetest little angel. I'm sure in 200 years or so, when you pass away, you'll go straight to heaven and be reunited with all those pet goldfish that died that time we fed them Oreos. Oh, I see. You weren't trying to get into heaven. You were trying to save your Aunt Tracy from going to hell. What do I do here? What do I say? How can I reassure a loved one that I'll be okay without sounding dismissive about their faith? I've been through this already once with my mother. See, when I came out to my parents, I was nervous AF, to the point of having panic attacks, despite the fact that my parents have always been loving and supporting, no matter how much I misbehaved. And honey, I tested the shit out of those boundaries. So I wrote them a letter. Coming out in a letter has a lot of benefits, even if you know your family's going to be accepting, because it gives the receiver of the letter some private time to process what you're saying. See, when you're ready to come out, this is something that's been on your mind for a while now, but to your family, this is breaking news. A letter gives them a chance to catch up a bit to where you are. So my parents came to visit me about a week after receiving the letter, and my mother had 3 major concerns. Number 1, how was I handling it when men found me attractive? And as soon as that happens, I'll let her know. Second, she was worried about how our extremely religious extended family might react. She told me she was just going to keep it a secret from them. I told her that's her prerogative. I wonder how that's going for her, keeping it a secret. And of course, she can't stand the thought of me suffering in hell for an eternity. And the thought of my mother worrying about this, it's been really hard to bear. Well, thank you, dear. I appreciate the invitation, but I don't want to go to church with you. Well, because your Aunt Tracy's an atheist, so I just wouldn't feel right going. Plus, I don't really like being there. The food service was atrocious. The last time I was there, they only had 1 stale saltine cracker for the entire congregation. Yeah, there was so little to eat, we all had to break off 1 teeny tiny little piece. No cheese or anything. It's no way to treat guests. What's an atheist? That just means I don't believe in any gods. Well, you know, I started being skeptical at a pretty young age. And then when I went to college and I started learning about art history and the various early civilizations of mankind and mythology, it just became harder and harder for me to accept a divine being. Even after all I learned, I found it difficult to embrace atheism, till I went on this amazing LSD trip, and then I really came to terms with it. Yeah. LSD, that stands for long, slow, distant. Yeah, it's a long, slow, distant trip. We're going with that. Well, yes, I still think you should go to church with your mommy and daddy. Because it's something you can do together, that's why. See, I don't have a problem with going to church in general. Your grandpa goes to church all the time to sing gospel music and he loves it. Why, I was in a church not that terribly long ago. Oh, well, back when I was volunteering at the LGBTQ Center, we teamed up with 7 churches in the area to bring a transgender theologian from Minnesota in to do a sermon. Oh no, he charged like thousands of dollars. Where'd we get the money? Well, there was a huge outpouring of donations from the community after your Aunt Tracy got in a public fight with the pastor at the local megachurch. You want to hear that story? I wouldn't even know how to begin to tell that story. I guess I could recreate it. Devil went down to Georgia style. But if I'm going to recreate a fight, I've got to get back in fighting shape. In this corner, wearing her Sunday best and sanctimoniously judging you behind a polite smile, it's the pastor of disaster, the minister of sinister. She puts the foe in transphobic. Please pass the collection plate for Simone Kess. And in the other corner, wearing a devilish grin and representing the garden of earthly delights, she's the high priestess with the leastest, the temptress from the Midwest, the dominatrix of HE double hockey sticks. Please welcome Aunt Tracy. Now allow me to provide a little bit of context so you know the true motivation behind this transphobic tirade you're about to hear. Now at the time, the city council where I live had recently passed a conversion therapy ban, the first of its kind in the state, which caused the media to pay attention. Well, it's a common tactic among religious organizations to attack a progressive achievement in hopes of siphoning media attention surrounding it for themselves. We do it on the left too. I mean, how many YouTube videos have you seen about a transphobic comedian? You know, early Christians were perceived as crazy, but everyone wanted them to live in their neighborhood. They wanted them in their community because they were kind, compassionate. Who started the first school? Christians. The first hospitals? Christians. The first libraries? Christians. So it was Christians who created the first schools, the first orphanages, and the first hospitals? I mean, why not mention these same achievements in Egypt and in China? Well, I guess that just doesn't count for some reason. Christians have always had beliefs that led them to live in a way that was offensive to the culture. And the thing that offended them was the belief that Jesus is the only way to God, and it's only through Jesus that a person can have salvation and have their sins forgiven. Hold up. Just so I'm sure I'm hearing you correctly, your position is that the most dominant religion on the planet is perpetually persecuted. Back in Rome in the 1st century, when much of the New Testament was written, the way the people of Rome lived, The vast majority of people were sexually promiscuous. They were financially stingy. They'd give their body to everyone, but their money to no one. And then Christians came along and turned that upside down. And that offended the culture in Rome. Gosh, I'm in a dill of a pickle here. If I can't get that little rascal back into Sunday school, my sister's going to make a burnt offering out of me. Perhaps I could just teach them Sunday school. Don't laugh, seriously. I've read the Bible twice, cover to cover, all 66 books. Probably not for the typical reasons, I wasn't trying to get into the clergy or looking for loopholes. And if you're shocked that I've read the Bible, I'm doubly shocked at how much of it I actually retained. The first time I read the Bible was my first semester in college. I signed up for this speed reading course because it was a 2-hour gen ed. I thought it'd be an easy A, and it was adjacent to the art center, so I wouldn't have to walk across campus. It wound up being one of the most practical courses I've ever taken. We would have these quizzes where paragraphs would flash up on the computer screen, and then you'd have to answer questions. And after I bombed the first one, much to my dismay, I realized I'm going to have to practice. The speed reading technique is like, instead of reading word by word, you read line by line or paragraph by paragraph. So the Bible is good for this because the print is small, and honestly, I was a little bit curious about it. Turn to Genesis book 1, verse 27. God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And here it is, the basis of the entire sermon. Transgender people are not valid because God said male and female, man and woman, end of story. Now we're going to deal with a sensitive topic. What does it mean when we say God created us male and female? And can we switch genders? If we're born male, can we become a female? Or the other way, if we're born female, can we become a male? So I told a few people that we were going to talk about this today, male and female, it's in the text, right? And they looked at me like, are you sure you want to do this? Well, we're talking about it everywhere else, aren't we? I remember when this came on everyone's radar in a major way, back when Bruce Jenner transitioned to Caitlyn Jenner. Ah, yes, the obligatory mention and dead naming of Caitlyn Jenner. This is a conversation that everybody's having, right? Arguments are being made before the Supreme Court on these issues. People in sports are asking this question, right? Because they're asking, can a biological male compete in women's sports? For Mayor Pete's sake, do we really have to talk about this today? Are we planning on making a video on that topic later? Yeah, table that one. How friggin' long do you want this video to be? Fair enough, I don't want to be here all day. We see trans characters and trans issues on television shows and in movies. So wouldn't it be weird to say, hey, we're going to talk about this everywhere, except church? Wouldn't that be weird? I came of age when there was no trans narrative in the culture. At least not one that I had access to. I've always been trans. But back then, I didn't have the language to describe myself. And so I couldn't name myself as transgender. And because the culture excluded transgender folks, my own subjective experience was constrained by the possibilities imposed upon me. As I grew older and activists made strides towards transgender liberation, society began to grow more inclusive. And I began to know myself as a trans woman. But because my exposure to that identity was limited, my understanding of myself was also limited. Even once I understood I was transgender, I didn't transition until many years later. Not because I didn't want to transition, but because it just seemed unattainable. I didn't know anyone who was trans. I didn't know what my medical choices were. I didn't have anyone to relate to. The only transgender people I ever saw were guests on Maury Povich. I certainly didn't see much of myself in them. Society does not influence people to be transgender, but it does have ways to compel you to remain closeted. The second time I read it, there was a big snowstorm in the Midwest, and I was trapped in a hotel in Dallas because all the flights to Kansas City kept getting canceled. I was out of money, I didn't know anyone, I couldn't go anywhere. So I just pulled the Bible out of the drawer and started reading it. I didn't quite finish it. I got to Revelations. I was all the way to the part with the eyeball monsters, so I decided to just take it with me and read it on the flight. In fact, I still have it. It's this copy right here. Now, if this doesn't illustrate that I'm over my fear of hell, I don't know what does. My overall impression, it's not a bad book. If you can hack your way through all the begats. Some of it is great, but not all of it. Every saga has its Attack of the Clones. Maybe, since we're talking about it everywhere, we need to think through it as Christians. Now, we're not going to talk about this in terms of partisan politics. We're not going to talk about this in terms of a culture war. So you don't want to take sides in a culture war? Aren't you addressing an auditorium full of people about what's going on in the culture and describing your stance on it? We're not even trying to win an argument. We don't want to win anything. No, I get it. You don't want to get in an argument. So go ahead, make your argument. What's right? What's best? What's according to God's plan? So we need to get on the same page here with a few terms. Gender identity is an important term. Gender identity is a person's internal sense of their gender, be it male or female or something else. Gender dysphoria is a condition where a person experiences discomfort or distress because there's a mismatch between their assigned gender at birth and their gender identity. A mismatch between their biological sex and their gender identity. What causes gender dysphoria? How many people have gender dysphoria? Well, it's hard to tell, right? Because it's internal, it's subjective, it's controversial, but nobody has a hard number on how many people experience gender dysphoria. Everybody agrees it's a fraction of the population. But a fraction of a country this size still leaves a lot of people. I've read estimates of 750,000 to 1 million people have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria. You keep hitting that fraction of the population thing, a fraction of the population. I see what you're up to. You're trying to poison the well so that if, for instance, a child were to come out to their parents, it'll be much easier for the parents to dismiss it. Now, why is gender dysphoria more common amongst younger people than older people? Maybe it's because it's more comfortable to talk about now, it's more socially acceptable. Transgender people being more visible in the culture today than we have been in the past does not mean that transgender people are a recent development, dear heart. I mean, you're a scholar of ancient Rome, right? So I'm sure you've heard of Empress Elagabalus. You know, the 3rd century transgender ruler of all of Rome. No? That's called erasure, darling. There have always been transgender people, even in societies that attempt to deny us. The Old Testament has this bizarre preoccupation with foreskins. They're used as dowries, and if God gets mad at you, you can just touch your foot with one and all is forgiven. What really struck me when I was reading it, though, is how much of it they never even mentioned when I was in Sunday school. They didn't even mention the best parts. Some of that book makes Game of Thrones read like Mother Goose. In one story, God's all mad at the Israelites, which is a recurring theme in this book, so he sells them to the Canaanite king. The prophet Deborah gets her boy Barak to round up some chariots and go fight and free the Israelites. Barak literally slays. So the Canaanite commander, Sisera, hightails it out of there back to his buddy's tent. But when he gets there, only his wife Jael is home. So he's like, I am tired from running. And Jael's like, well, here, let me cover you with a blanket, and here's some nice warm milk so you'll fall asleep. But the thing is, Jael's kind of kinky. She's into pegging. And what I mean by that is, she grabs a hammer and a tent stake and hammers his frigging skull into the ground. People are identifying this way because they're being influenced by the culture, by their peers. You're not suggesting being transgender is contagious, are you? Or maybe it's through social influence. Of course, children are simply being seduced by the glamorous lifestyle of the average trans. I mean, you've seen my luxurious apartment, the difficulty I've had finding a job, holding a relationship. Doesn't it sound wonderful? This notion that transgender people are created by social influence is both dismissive and destructive. Dismissive because it contends that a transgender person's gender is not intrinsic the way a cisgender person's is. Destructive because describing transgender identities as just a phase will justify discrimination and exclusion and intolerance. There's a study out of Brown University, the elite university, Brown University, and they found that social influence was a significant part, not the only part, but a significant part of why more younger people today are coming out as transgender. But there are some activists that loudly and vociferously protested this study. So Brown University pulled it off its website and apologized. The reason, my dear, that Brown University pulled that study is because it was riddled with flaws. The study relied on a survey of parents who had visited websites promoting anti-transgender views. And the studies were biased by the wording of the study's own consent forms. This study basically pathologized transgender people, kind of like you're doing right now. Don't you get that? Don't you see all you're doing is further stigmatizing an already disenfranchised community? 80%. Here's a fact. 80% of gender dysphoria resolves itself in a child by the time that child passes puberty. 80%? Are you saying this with a straight face? 80%? That's an incredibly exorbitant sounding number. So of course it isn't true. Every culture has ways that it expresses masculinity and femininity. This is masculinity, this is femininity. And they try to enforce those very narrow definitions. There's no biblical description of masculinity or femininity. If I played with toy trucks when I was a little one, my family didn't freak out about it. Jesse Single in New York Magazine says, while the actual percentages vary from study to study, overall it appears that 80% of kids with gender dysphoria end up feeling okay with the bodies they were born into. That's important to know. This study, with the 80% number, included gender nonconforming behavior as well as gender dysphoria. So if you're a little girl that likes to play with toy trucks, you were included. And the geniuses that conducted the study couldn't locate 45% of the children for a follow-up. So they just decided to assume that all of those children were desisters. And that's what makes that 80% number so ridiculous. We don't know how many of those children ended up transitioning, but we don't even know how many of those children had gender dysphoria in the first place. Children who actually meet the clinical definition of gender dysphoria wind up being transgender adults. I could have told you that. I tried for so long to resist being transgender, to suppress it, to ignore it. I was just hoping one day I'd grow out of it. Years of living disingenuously and disassociating from my feelings began to take its toll on my mental health. I developed a pretty serious drug problem. How serious? You ever go through drive-thru just to order a straw? As our culture grew more progressive, more people felt safe coming out as transgender, which granted me more access to experiences similar to my own. I eventually recovered enough sense of self to realize that I was worthy of happiness. Fortunately for me, I lived in a community where it'd be safe to transition, where I had access to wellness counseling and gender-affirming healthcare. And that's why I get so frustrated when folks like you start poisoning my community with your hateful rhetoric. Now here's a safety tip for the ladies coming from Deuteronomy 25. If your man gets into an argument with another dude and the fists start flying, don't try to break it up. And if you do, be super careful not to touch the other guy's junk, because it's God's law that the men stop fighting and cut off your hand. First of all, we're all creatures, not the creator. God created us. He created our minds and our bodies, and he called that very good. Now what that means is God designed our bodies to work together, male and female. So Genesis 1:27 teaches that God created two genders that are not interchangeable, two genders that are not arbitrary, two genders that together resemble God, male and female. So that shows that gender is not superficial to who we are. Gender is not malleable. God created mankind in his own image. Male and female, he created them. So the Bible is God's word, and God's word is sacrosanct. And the Bible is gospel and God's law, and therefore we must always obey God's law and do what's in the Bible. Luke 6:30, give to anyone who asks, and when things are taken from you, don't try to get them back. Give me $50. Yeah, I don't carry any money in this outfit. Hypocrite! Excuse me. The gender binary, which a lot of people talk about derisively, like, oh, you believe there's a binary? Yes, I do. And what people often call the gender binary is not evidently rooted in the patriarchy. Genesis 1:27 says that it is rooted in God. You don't see the irony in what you just said? Patriarchy, Christianity, potato, potato, sweetheart. Now, God seems to think that our gender is very important to who we are as people. Gender is not a social construct. And God is not pleased when we blur genders. It all comes down to this, doesn't it? Who's your authority? It just comes down to the simple question, who's your authority? It's not more complicated than that. I could put more verses up. I could tell you more verses, but it'd be beside the point. Excuse me, ladies, but it is I who is I am. Yeah, that's the ticket. I have 3 additional commandments. Like, comment, and subscribe to Aunt Tracy's Place YouTube channel. Okay, that's really all I had to say. So, don't forget to say your prayers and eat your vitamins and believe in yourself. Hasta la vida, Zane. In the second book of Kings, the prophet Elijah, he's on his way to the town of Bethel, and Elijah's a little bit sensitive about his male pattern baldness. So this group of boys start harassing him, and they're yelling, "Get out of here, Baldy!" So Elijah summons 2 bears, who proceed to tear the children limb from limb. Bit of an overreaction. Let me tell a little story to illustrate my point. Imagine there's a Viking, like a warrior from 1,000 years ago. And this Viking finds 2 strong impulses in his heart. One impulse is for violence, and the other impulse is he thinks he's a woman trapped in a man's body. The Viking has gender confusion, gender dysphoria. Now he would probably think, what, like this violence, that's the right him, that's the real him. Because his culture would affirm that. His culture would tell him that warriors like you are intended to break things and kill people. So we champion that. We applaud that. Now this other part of him, this gender dysphoria, this confusion about his gender, he would repress that. He'd go, "Oh, I can't think about it. That's not appropriate." Who wants to tell her about Loki? Not a Disney Plus subscriber, are you, honey? In Norse mythology, Loki was gender fluid, sometimes adopting a male form, sometimes adopting a female form. In one old Norse poem, Loki lived here on Earth for 8 years as a woman. She milked a cow, she had sex with a man, she gave birth to a child. You know, every girl's dream. Now what if that same Viking with the same 2 impulses walked in here today? It'd be just the opposite, right? To the violence and aggression, we'd be like, hey, you need to see a therapist. But for this desire to express yourself as a woman, our culture would applaud. So you can imagine him repressing the violence in this culture and being comfortable with his gender change. So you're saying Viking Day, condemn transgender, applaud violence. And today, Uno reverse. Yeah, you're right. There's no violence today in American culture, is there? ACAB. By the by, if you want to know what Vikings were up to circa 1,000 years ago, King Canute ruled over England, Denmark, and Norway. King Canute, who we shall henceforth refer to by his rap name, King C-Nut, because it's spelled that way and it's exponentially funnier. Our man, King C-Nut, was a devoted Christian. His ecumenical gifts were widespread and often exuberant, just like I like my guys. With one bishop writing, "When we saw the gifts that you had given us, we were amazed by your knowledge and your faith. Since you, who we thought was a pagan prince, turned out not only to be a Christian, but a most generous donor to God's servants in church." He sounds vicious, doesn't he? But you see, there's no appeal to right or wrong. There's no appeal to a higher authority. It's just the cultural moment you're in. That's what happens when you just follow the culture as your lord. You just surrender whatever the culture says. Are you sure you want to do that? Because culture gets a lot of things wrong. It wasn't that long ago that our culture said slavery was fine. Are you okay with that culture? No? Yes, that is very true. American culture used to condone slavery. First book of Peter, 2:18. You who are slaves must submit to your masters with all respect. Do what they tell you, not only if they are kind and reasonable, but even if they are cruel. Let's see, what else? Oh, Colossians Chapter 3, verse 22. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything you do. Try to please them all the time, not just when they are watching. Serve them sincerely because of your reverent fear of the Lord. Oh, here's a fun one. Exodus 21, verses 20 and 21. If a man beats his male or female slave with a club and the slave dies as a result, the owner must be punished. But if the slave recovers within a day or two, then the owner shall not be punished, since the slave is his property. Culture is going to mislead you. There was even a Supreme Court decision behind it. 1857, Dred Scott, look it up. Supreme Court decision that denied citizenship to black people. But Jesus is Lord. Jesus is Lord over culture and over you and over me and over our bodies. I guess the point you're trying to make is that the culture is fickle and flawed and God's law is immutable and unalterable. Let's look at an example. Let's see, off the top of my head, let's think of the church's position on, I don't know, slavery in the Dred Scott decision. Now, had you been a Northern Baptist during this time, you would applaud the court's decision, believing God would not condone treating one race as superior to another. However, had you been a Southern Baptist, you would know that God intended the races to be separate. And both versions of you can find evidence in the Bible to back up what you're saying. Apparently, God has a problem with mixed race couples. See, he's hanging out with Moses at the tent of meeting, and God's in a mood because the Israelite men have been marrying Moabite women and worshiping Baal. So he tells Moses, I need you to kill all the ringleaders and display all their bodies as a warning, mother of dragons style. So this one Israelite brings home a Midianite woman back to his tent for a little rendezvous, and this cat Phineas grabs a spear and shish kebabs them together. Eventually, they got over their problem with mixed race couples, I guess, because God ordered the Israelites to run in and kill all the married Midianite women. But he says, it's cool if you keep the virgins as sex slaves. There's a difference between the way we talk to an individual and the way we participate in a cultural conversation. Speak the truth in love. But I just want to take a second and ask some questions for our culture. Questions for the activists. Not the average person just trying to live their life. The activists. Okay, when this sermon was first actually given, to make his point about activists being trouble, the pastor decided to show a picture in church. A picture of a pre-World War II fascistic rally in Germany. Rhymes with Yahtzee. 1 Corinthians 6. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, who you have received from God? You are not your own. You are bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. So let's talk about a couple topics here. Pronouns. What do you do? Do you call somebody by their preferred pronoun, even if it's not in line with their biology? There's no chapter or verse on this, but here's what I would say. I call people whatever name they present themselves with. Oh, how magnanimous of you to use my preferred pronoun, even if it's not in line with my biology. If they introduce themselves by a certain name, that's just what I call them. Maybe that's wrong, but I just don't want to put up a wall between me and that person just to make some stand. Listen, we don't call them preferred pronouns. We don't need that qualifier. They're just pronouns. Calling them preferred pronouns sort of implies that there's a true pronoun out there that is in alignment with our biology. I'm going to call them by whatever name. I'll call you by whatever name you want. The way you explain pronouns is kind of a bad look. Not quite showing a picture of National Socialists in church bad, but still something to avoid. I just don't think it's that big of a deal. What you just said there reminds me of the time I was approached by a gentleman who wanted to show how open-minded he was. And he told me, hey, I'll call you whatever you want. If you told me that you were a turtle, I'll call you a turtle. Come on, honey, I'm not delusional. I don't think I'm a pizza-eating ninja. And if I did, I would expect you to get me on the proper medication ASAP. If you think that people who use the correct pronouns to refer to a transgender person are just playing along with us, then you're just not getting it. Look, I'm not going to take a deep dive here into why pronouns never have and never do have any basis in biology. There's already an amazing video by a much more popular transgender YouTuber than your Aunt Tracy, who explains it better than I ever could. You should go check that out. I'm certain if you're watching one of my videos, you'll be recommended one of hers. Are we sure that we want to throw away God's design and deconstruct gender? Are we sure that it's best for kids, or adults, but especially kids, to go through gender reassignment surgery? Okay, now you're just straight up making things up. Minors do not get gender reassignment surgery. It wouldn't even make sense medically. I'll be able to get this camel through the eye of this needle before a minor has GRS. Have you read the detransitioning stories? Do you know in the best studies out of Sweden, in 10 to 15 years after experiencing gender reassignment surgery, the suicide rate is 20 times greater for those individuals than it is for the average population? And of course, this Swedish study is also terribly inaccurate and misleading. This study did in fact find that the suicide rate for transgender folks who've had gender-affirming surgery is higher than it is for the general population. But what the study did not do is compare the transgender population to itself pre and post surgery. Therefore, the only thing we can accurately glean from this study is that transgender people are at a higher suicide rate than their cisgender counterparts. What the study cannot tell you is why that is. This study didn't even try to examine what role factors such as bullying or being rejected by family may have played in this increased risk. Perhaps someone lost hope after facing discrimination and harassment while living in a community that's being poisoned by harmful and dangerous rhetoric. Are you sure it's best? Have you read any of these stories? Have you read the story in the New York Times, "My new blank won't make me happy"? Vagina, my new vagina. Say it. Vagina, vagina, vagina. It's about a biological male transitioning to a woman. And it's heartbreaking to read. You cannot read this story without feeling compassion for this person. It's raw, it's reality, and this person knows they're getting ready to have a surgery that won't help them at all. Okay, you are completely misrepresenting that article written by Andrea Long-Chu. The article called "My New Vagina Won't Make Me Happy." And it shouldn't have to. In the article, Long-Chu was trying to make the point that medically necessary gender-affirming procedures should not be denied to transgender people. And all gender-affirming procedures are medically necessary, darling. Long-Chu's wording was rather reckless, because it could reasonably be read as though surgeries don't contribute to transgender wellness. She made it sound like, if anything, it makes us worse off than we were before. A lot of us trans folk were afraid that the wording she used would be used to do just that, deny healthcare. Regret is exceedingly rare, with studies showing that 0.3% to 3.8% of people regretted their transition. And the primary reasons reported for dissatisfaction were a lack of social support and older, poor surgical techniques. 93% of studies report that transitioning improved overall wellness for transgender people. Now, in the article "My Happy Vulva," written by transgender writer Florence Ashley, who's had the same surgery as Long-Chu, Ashley agrees that Long-Chu made some pretty good points about gatekeeping. Cisgender people get to have the gendered bodies they desire. Why can't transgender people? Are we sure that it's best for government to tell us which pronouns we should use? The government makes you use pronouns? What country do you think this is? Are we sure it's best to give puberty blockers to children? Who thinks it's best? A partial list. The American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, the Endocrine Society, the College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. Are we sure when 80% of kids have this reconciled by the time they reach puberty? This 80% narrative is built on bad statistics, bad science, transphobia and homophobia. Now these are hard questions. I don't know the answers, but are we sure? What about another set of questions that's different, that, goes something like this? If people's subjective internal feelings can define reality, then why not with other identities? Are we going to be consistent about that? Consistency? We want to talk about consistency? Aren't there 2 books of Genesis in the Bible with 2 different creation stories? I mean, forgive me if I'm wrong, but isn't there a different order of creation in both of those books? When was mankind created? When were the animals created? Were men and women created at the same time, or were they created separately? The flood story. Was it 40 days or was it 150 days? Consistency. Rachel Dolezal. Rachel Dolezal. What's that cisgender woman have to do with any of this? Presented herself as black. Turns out she was exposed as being a white woman. Name one other person who wants to switch their race. There's more transgender people living in my building than you can name who want to switch their race, darling. There's transgender people everywhere. But you're picking this one example of this one silly woman. Yeah, the reason that story got around is because that woman was so far out there. And not because she represented a larger community of marginalized individuals seeking liberation from unfair treatment from an unjust society. She says some confusing things, but she makes some really interesting points in light of this conversation. Don't we all have the right to be exactly who we are, she says? So why was it wrong for her to present herself as black? If that's how she felt, if that was her identity. And this is a very turfy way of trying to accuse transgender people of co-opting somebody else's experience as their own. No transgender people are claiming that our experience is equal to that of a cisgender person. No, it's far different. Believe you me. Are you familiar with body integrity disorder? It's when people have a mismatch in their mind about how they think about their body and in the reality. They often identify like a limb as something that they don't like, something that they don't want. Why, you're being so subtle. Whatever could you possibly be referring to? Now, there's nothing wrong with this limb physically, biologically. It's perfectly fine. Now, they want that limb cut off. They want a doctor to come along and surgically amputate a perfect, healthy limb. Look, I'll spare you the details, but trust me, honey, it's always been vestigial. And that's the bottom line. I mean, are we going to be consistent? Shouldn't we be helping people make their thinking process conform to their physical reality? What about anorexia? Anorexia and body dysmorphia. Those 2 things are clearly distinct from gender dysphoria. That would be like if I said that Hinduism, Christianity, and Scientology were all the same because they share some characteristics. I mean, sure, they're all religions, but they're distinct. For instance, they all worship a different God, and they all have a different interpretation of God's law. You believe your God divided people into 2 distinct genders, male and female. Whereas someone living in India might believe that the Hindu God divided everyone into 4 castes. And both y'all would try to tell me that God is displeased whenever we try to blend these categories. When someone has an internal feeling, a subjective feeling, and they see themselves different than the reality, what do? Do we just go with what they say is true? We don't do that now. What we do is we try to help their thinking process, their emotional process, so that it realigns itself with physical reality. The only fool here attempting to alter reality is you. No transgender person ever said that hormones, genitalia, chromosomes, anatomy didn't exist. These things exist. But trying to assign roles and expectations to certain combinations of these characteristics is a social construct. An unnecessary, pointless, and harmful social construct at that. My goal this morning is to speak the truth. To speak the truth about God's law. Not buying it. Maybe you're here today and you present yourself different than your biology. Maybe you want to go by a different pronoun than your biological one. I just want you to know we're so glad you're here. I think the thing that we have to offer to transgender people is our compassion. Because we know what it's like to be broken. Brokenness in our body, brokenness in our soul. Who are you calling broken? I'm not broken. Transgender people aren't broken. Your brain is broken. Transgender people are not confused. We don't have gender confusion. We know what our gender is just the same way any cisgender person knows theirs. The only difference being, when we tell people our gender, some of y'all choose not to believe us. We know we live in a sin-cursed world. Now do I look wicked and evil to you? It all just comes down to, is Jesus my authority or is culture my authority? Are we imposing our culture, our beliefs, our values on the Bible? Or do we surrender and submit and put the Lord's word above us? Even if I don't like it, I'm going to surrender to it because God has authority in our lives. It just comes down to authority. Is it culture or is it Jesus? Should we submit ourselves to the authority of a celestial dictatorship? Or should we succumb to the pressures imposed on us by our culture? Neither. The answer's neither. We all know that. Our morality, our dignity, our self-respect, and yes, even our gender, those come from within. Listen, I'm going to paraphrase a guy that I'm not exactly a fan of here. Christopher Hitchens, who was an imperialist and an Islamophobe, if you ask your Aunt Tracy. But, you know, he has a good point here. Plus, he's been worm food for like a decade, so who's he gonna hurt? In The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, how does Huck Finn know that he should not betray his friend Jim and give him up to the people who are hunting him? How does Mark Twain know that we will approve of Huck when he refuses this? Huck believes that the law is against him, that the church is against him, that all the preachments of religion and customary law are against him. Huck thinks if he refuses to give up Jim, he's going straight to hell. But Huck chooses to do the right thing. Morality is innate in us. Religion gets its morality from us. Society gets its gender roles from us. We had the power inside of ourselves the whole time. Speaking the truth in love, because we know that Jesus comes and forgives and changes. My problem with you is that you're being opportunistic. You hastily chose to give a sermon without doing an ounce of legitimate research. Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. You just trotted out the same old tired and discredited propaganda that's constantly being used to exclude transgender people from receiving equal treatment. And it's getting really old. Come to me, all ye who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. What you've said here today is going to be used to create conflict within communities and families. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. It's going to be used to justify discrimination and harassment. For I am gentle and humble in heart. It is absolutely insidious that you choose to use the pulpit this way. And you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Amen. At first, we were all pretty worried about what the aftermath might be. I was way too fired up in the moment to think about possible retaliation. I mean, this is a mega church. They could mega powerful enemy. But I can be very protective of my community when I perceive us as being under attack. When you go after Mama Bear's cubs, the claws come out. Snicked. But the way the town responded was heartwarming. Donations started pouring in. And then someone came up with the idea to team up with the inclusive churches in town and bring in that transgender theologian that I mentioned earlier. Now, not everyone was on board with spending the money like this. And this guy was charging a lot of money. Like, a lot of money. Many transgender people avoid church, either because they don't feel welcome there, or they're secular humanists, or perhaps it's the thousands of years that some churches have sought to demonize us. This is the Midwest. Plenty of queer and transgender people grew up attending church. It's where all their friends are. It's brought a lot of joy into their lives. And even if it was just a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of transgender people who regularly attended services, I just had to do what I could to make sure that they were going to be okay. Plus, this fight was all over local TV and made all the papers. I didn't want an adversarial dynamic between the religious and the LGBTQIA+ community to settle in like a mist. Let's face it, there's a lot more of them than there are of us. I thought it would be best to make peace if we wanted to maintain a relatively safe environment here. Now, your Aunt Tracy's going to go off on a tangent here. Oh no, not you, Aunt Tracy. You're not going to find this in any one single textbook. I've come to this conclusion from a lifetime of self-reflection and self-examination, and hallucinogens. But I have come to identify 3 necessary components that I need to keep in my utility belt if I want to be happy. And I even gave them the cute little ABC to remember them by: autonomy, belonging, and charity. Autonomy, of course, referring to having a sense of control over your own life, being able to make your own choices. Belonging is a sense of belonging, whether it be a found family or a group of friends or a club that you really like going to. Everyone feels happier when they feel like they belong to something. And charity is charity. It's altruism. It's doing things for other people. So I went and listened to this theologian give his sermon. He offered a different interpretation of Bible verses. He was like, God said man and woman, but he also said day and night. What about dawn? What about dusk? He said land and sea. What about the swamp? That was his whole thing. Now, did this help people? Did this bring comfort? I don't know. But there was a meet and greet after the sermon for transgender and non-binary people only. And that is the thing that I wanted to go to, because I wanted to check up on my kids. Now, there are about a dozen or so kids there. And when I say kids, they were younger than me, but, not minors. And it kind of felt like our expensive theologian was more interested in stuffing his face with the free sandwiches we provided than he was offering any guidance or solace or comfort to the trans people who were there. And while I was there talking to them and listening to their concerns, I realized why I had gotten so angry in the first place. Pastor Simone tried to rob these kids of the B and C components of happiness. They felt a strong sense of belonging at their church. It's the place where they could give to others and feel good about it. And no matter how much Pastor Simone wanted to claim that this was a welcoming atmosphere for transgender people, you can't spend 45 minutes delivering a diatribe about why our identities are invalid and then claim to be supportive, to be accepting. It doesn't work that way, sweetie. Did you notice how Pastor Simone kept repeatedly asking us the question, should we allow someone's subjective internal feelings to define reality? Well, she better believe the answer is yes, because that's called faith. What she's describing is faith. There's a story in the Bible, Exodus 33, in which Moses wants God to appear before the Israelites so that they have proof of his existence. So they're hanging out in the tent of meeting, and Moses says, God, just show me your glory. And God says, humans cannot look upon my visage, or it'll just blow your tiny little minds and your head will start bleeding. But Moses keeps just crying and whining, please, please, please me. And God's finally like, you know what, if it'll just shut you up, we'll make a deal. I'm going to put you in the cleft of a rock, and then I'm going to walk by and I'll cover it with my hand as I pass, so you can't see my face. But then as I go along, you can look at my backside. I don't know, apparently you can't look at God's face, but you can check out his ass. Anyway, the point is, even though you can't see God, if you believe in miracles, then you believe you see evidence of God in miracles. And no one can see your gender either. Like Pastor Simone said, it's internal, it's subjective. You can only see evidence of gender. And just like religions have different interpretations of what is or what isn't a miracle, culture can have different ideas of what defines gender roles. I often hear Christians say that I have a personal relationship with Jesus. And I believe that everyone has their own unique and personal relationship to gender. And the cool thing is, none of us are wrong or right. It's not about winning an argument. It's about appreciating the time we have together, the experiences we share. We can do things together and love one another without demanding adherence to a consistent and identical interpretation of our experiences. See, kiddo, it doesn't matter whether I believe in heaven or not. If you believe that there's a posthumous existence in the kingdom of heaven, and you do your best to get there, then I know that's where you're going to end up. Because if there's one lesson from the Bible that I agree with, it's that you have to have faith. You have to have faith to get through day to day. Whether it's faith in God, or science, or your fellow human beings, or the Easter Bunny, or George Michael. Everyone believes in something, even nihilists. You know, there was a great prophet, a baseball player named Mookie Wilson, who said, "When I'm in a slump, I comfort myself by saying, if I believe in dinosaurs, then somewhere they must be believing in me. And if they believe in me, then I can believe in me. Then I bust out." Mookie's reciprocal faith in dinosaurs certainly paid off, resulting in a career .274 batting average with 67 touchdowns and an NBA championship ring. We should all try to be more like Mookie. And listen, sweetie, I promise you, I'm not going to hell. How do I know? Well, because you're going to heaven. And there's no suffering in heaven. So if it would make you sad to know that I was rotting in hell, if that knowledge would cause you to suffer, then I guess hell doesn't exist. What do I think is going to happen to me after I die? Well, nobody knows that for sure, sweetie. I imagine it's probably similar to what it was like before I was born. And that wasn't so bad. Now let us pray. Look, up in the sky. It's a bird, it's a plane, it's Superman. Give us this day our daily planet. Protect us with your heat vision, as you protect those in the bottle city of Candor. Deliver us from dark side, and lead us not into the phantom zone. For thine is the man of tomorrow, and the fortress of solitude, and the up, up, and away. Excelsior. Well, you've seen most of it. What do you think? Yes, I have heard that. I don't think an incoherent narrative necessarily indicates psychopathy. Oh, guess what? Call on the other line. I'll call you back. Hello, Nasty. Hey, how was church? Well, what would you call it if somebody drove a tent peg through your temple? Well, let me check the calendar, make sure I don't have any conflicts. Now I think I'm free. Oh, well, yeah, you know it'd be my pleasure. I won't let you down. Okay. Alright, I'll see you soon. Bye. Guess what? Kiddo's gonna start getting off the bus after school here. I'm like the best babysitter. I'd teach you, but I'd have to charge.